Welcome to the Newland Rock Leadership Effectiveness Podcast, hosted by me, Kate Thomas. This podcast is packed with practical tips and expert views to unlock the leadership effectiveness in you and your organisation. My name is Kate Thomas, and I'm a leadership effectiveness expert and the founder of Newland Rock, a consultancy dedicated to focusing on increasing leadership effectiveness for talent-savvy companies and individuals. In this podcast, I will share my experience of supercharging leadership performance and business results with you. Join me and the best thought leaders for topical discussions and talent-centric insights. Welcome to this week's Leadership Effectiveness Podcast, and today I'm joined by Melody Moore, an occupational psychologist by training. Melody's career started in the mid-90s as a manager at the National Health Service in the UK. And she changed gears and thought she would try her hand at management consulting, clearly enjoying it, and has now spent over 20 years helping UK and global organisations develop world-class leaders. After many years working for large global consultancies, Melody recently decided to strike out on her own and has set up Liberare Consulting. Liberare Consulting is leadership assessment, development, executive coaching, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. A massive fan of podcasts, and she decided to launch her own, The Secret Resume podcast, at the beginning of this year. It's an absolute pleasure to have Melody join us today as we discuss a little bit more around leadership effectiveness and the strategic importance of incorporating assessment. Melody, welcome, and thank you so much for finding the time. We started this conversation a few months ago, so great that we are now together and are able to get a little bit deep and meaningful on this whole world of assessment, and a world that you and I have been in for quite some time.
Yes, too long to say, yes.
Too long to say from... We just don't want to give away all of our secrets, right?
Exactly.
And I was thinking about us having this conversation and thinking about our audience and all of the expertise that you can bring to this space. And to selfishly then put the hat on and go, okay, what do I really want to talk to Melody about? And for me, as you know, I spend all of my time focused on leadership effectiveness, what it is that leaders need to do to get themselves into that space where they really are at the top of their game. And assessment for me plays an important part of that. And I was just curious, with your experience, when would you say assessment is important from a leadership effectiveness perspective?
Well, I think there's always, Kate, you and I have been consultants for a long time, and there's always multiple clients, aren't there, or interested parties in leadership effectiveness, because there's the organisation and when is it good for them and when could it help them, and then there's also the individual who's being assessed, and actually, as a sort of ripple effect, their team and the people that they are leading are also impacted by an individual being assessed. So there's lots of different people and lots of different perspectives as to when it's a good time and why it's a good time to have it. So should we pick that apart and talk
Well,
about
I definitely want to pick apart the ripple effect as well. I think that's a really interesting one. But yes, the organisation, the individual, then the team that this individual, as in this leader, serves, the ripple effect of that in itself is a big topic.
So I think, there's something about bench strength that might be important. How is your leadership bench strength? And again, like I say, if there's a change in strategy and therefore competencies that are going to be required for that strategy, getting a sense of the the bench strength of your organization. I think it's really helpful from an assessment for selection perspective. If you are bringing someone in from the outside, it can be really helpful, or at least assessing people externally and maybe comparing them to internal, getting that objective sense of how do they compare to each other, which can be very difficult if you know some individuals and you don't know others. Then getting that some objective data from both internal and external candidates can be really powerful in helping you make decisions. Otherwise, I think there's often a tendency to go for the people that we know.
As you're talking there, it sort of reminds me of, in my experience, it's very rare that I would conduct an assessment and not present back and there be some element of surprise, particularly because when you think about people that have been in the organisation for quite a while, consciously or unconsciously, you end up being somewhat pigeonholed with certain characteristics, or there's certain things that you're always seen to do, but as we know, there is so much more in people that the assessment often brings out, to say, those surprises, those, wow, I didn't expect to hear that. And actually, as you present them to me, and maybe there's a cluster of people in a cohort, as we call, there's often a surprise going, okay, that external eye saw something that I just haven't had the opportunity to see. And that's always, whilst that surprise is always very positive, because we're bringing something in addition to the conversation.
Yeah, I think sometimes as well you confirm things that they have a slight suspicion about, that they don't know for certain. Sometimes you're confirming someone's gut view on someone as well. So having something that's more concrete and reinforces that can be really useful. And I think, to that point, that kind of surprises that you can bring, that can be incredibly useful with, and I know we're going to talk later a bit more about diversity, but with diverse candidates. So having a broader pool of candidates than you might, we make judgments of people, and we have biases whether we like it or not. And so an external objective assessment of individuals can bring some real surprises. And I've had clients say, where's this person been? And maybe they didn't know them. So just because someone's internal doesn't mean you know them, and where's this person been all my life, kind of thing, because you're bringing them information and good, strong information on someone that they knew less. So it's not always an external person. It might just be someone who's kind of outside of their group, or just the group of people that they know.
Yeah, outside of their immediate network. I don't see you that often, therefore I don't really hear of you that often. And wow, I didn't realise you had so much more that you can offer us. It's a really exciting conversation when that shows up.
It makes me think as well about people who maybe they worked with them like 10 years ago, and people change and they grow, but our views of them, especially if they've gone off and we haven't seen them much in that time, but we often have quite outdated views of people. So having an assessment that is much more up to date helps bring your view of them up to date as well.
Interesting you say that. We can often have outdated views of others, but I often think, maybe now I'm putting my executive coaching hat on here, I often think that as leaders, we can have outdated views on ourselves and how assessment can really hold up the mirror and bring you up to the now.
Yeah, and I think that it can also help you understand why as well, particularly if, we're using assessments with diagnostics that go a bit deeper. You know, when we're looking at people's traits or their drivers, it can really help people understand why they do what they do. And I've certainly had plenty of people say to me that they've really enjoyed the assessment and they didn't expect to. But it's been a really good activity to reflect on what they do and why they do it, particularly, you know, in the way that you and I tend to interview, using that more sort of behavioural event interviewing style, where you're getting into why people do things and what was their thinking behind it and what did they learn from it, and people actually quite enjoy being forced to reflect in that way.
I think that talks so much to the fact that when we think about leadership effectiveness, such an important part of a leader's role is to create some time to pause and reflect and make connections. And I often say to any leader who I'm meeting for an assessment, view this as one of your most indulgent self-focused sessions of your career so far, because all we're going to talk about is you. All I'm interested in is you, and everything that goes on in the world of you. And that's quite uncomfortable to begin with, because it's rare that a leader does it. But like you say, the reflections and the connections and those aha moments that can come out just from that one conversation, albeit it runs for a few hours, but it can be a pivotal point for when leaders recognise that there are things that they can dial up and dial down in order to ensure that they stay at the top of their game.
Yeah. The plenty of people have said, oh, I didn't think I was going to be able to talk about myself for this long, because they're not used to doing that.
Yeah,
but they can. They always can. And I think, you know, for a lot of people, and you know, I find the same with coaching, it feels like an indulgence, but it's a real pleasure for people to have someone who's listening to them and really interested in them and wants to know more about them for an extended period of time. You know, it never happens in our lives. You know, it's much more common that we'll be conversational, and you know, there's an expectation in a conversation that you ask questions as well as answer them, whereas when we're assessing and when we're coaching, they're not asking us questions on the whole. It's all about them, and it's an unusual situation, which I think people typically find quite rewarding.
Yeah. And that sort of reward of time that you spend. And then, as you know, talking back to that earlier point that you raised around, you know, maybe that assessment for what, and that time that you spend leads to having some sort of concrete evidence to bring you into a more robust development conversation. So if your organization is going through change, which by and large is happening every few years, irrespective of economic changes, organizations do change because they want to advance. Therefore, how do I know what my development focus goals should be? What are the things that I should be doing differently? What's in my toolkit that I haven't needed to use for a while, but actually that assessment reminded me of a time when I did X, Y, and Z, and look what happened. It sort of brings a lot of colour to someone's career, I think.
Yeah, I often, because, you know, there's a very sort of black and white or transactional way of thinking about assessment is, you know, you need to focus on the areas you're not so good, or where you've got development areas, let's say weaknesses. And you know, you don't need to focus on your strengths, and actually the truth is that the context is incredibly important. So, you know, you don't really necessarily need to develop something if it's not going to be important in your role or in the organization, and it's much more about what is needed of you in your job, in your organizational culture, and you know, what the business expects of you. So for me, the question is always, you know, what is the impact of that particularly high score, that particularly low score? What does it matter? I just think that's really important.
I think that is really important, especially when we know that when there is a lower score, that's often where your high achiever will spend their time. Well, I need to bring that one up because that's my lower score. As you say, the context of, well, what does that low score now mean to where you want to go, what's going on for you, etc., etc. Organizational focus as well as individual focus. Actually, that low score could be telling us something about where you could be of a higher performing person, given maybe you take on a different position. There's a lot of insights that we get.
Yes, and I think there can be too much focus on bringing up lower scores. And I remember years ago working with someone who was really interested in people having spikes in an overall competency model, rather than necessarily wanting everybody to have a minimum of a 3 on whatever, but actually having some spikes and some real strengths, and not saying that everybody has to be the same and not everybody has to perform the same, have the same competencies. But I think from an individual perspective, increasingly, I think that what makes us happy is being in a role that really suits us, and it stretches us, but it suits us. And the way I always describe, in particular when we're looking at things like traits and things that are maybe not our natural preference, is it's the kind of thing that goes to the bottom of your to-do list. And if you're in a job that requires a lot of the behaviours that typically would go to the bottom of your to-do list, it's just unlikely to be a job that you're really going to enjoy for any length of time. So having a job that is better suited to what you really enjoy and what you're really good at, I believe that's where happiness lies in the workplace. And that isn't to say that people can't develop and shouldn't develop. Yes, they can, and yes, they should if they want to and need to. But I also think from an individual perspective of using an assessment process as a way of understanding what's uniquely you, and how might you best serve the business, the organisation, the world, whatever it is really where what's going to make us happy, not just progressing and developing things because they're lower than the others.
That happiness leads into success, just organically, being in flow.
And what is success?
Sense to me.
And actually questioning, well, what is success? Is success just constantly moving up an organisation, or is it about finding, which may require certain behaviours that are more or less comfortable for us, or is it actually about finding those particular roles and those particular things to do that really get us going, and really we're in our, like you say, in flow, in our sweet spot, and you can kind of extend what that sweet spot is. But if it's radically different to where you are now, I don't think that really brings people happiness.
It typically, in my experience, brings people stretch and stress. So this is when we end up in that burnout zone, and we end up in that zone of feeling quite disillusioned of what it's all about.
And it's how much stress and how much stretch, and you can have too much and it's really bad for you over time. It might be all right for a short period, but it does lead to burnout. It does lead to just not being in a very good place. So to me, it's about the right amount of stretch that's important. And so these kind of conversations, and it kind of links to this idea of assessment for leadership effectiveness. As just as important as the assessment is the debrief afterwards. You know, the conversation, the coaching that happens after. So the information is not just for the organisation, and of course, depending on what the assessment is for, the organisation may or may not even have that information on an individual. But as you know, as the person who's being assessed, there's so much richness in that information for you, that I'm always astounded when people say they don't want feedback after an assessment.
There's something in that when somebody is shying away potentially from what the assessment will say, and those are the individuals that actually I want to speak to even more. Because I feel like as if we really need this conversation. I'm not here to catch you out. I'm here very much to support you and help you get to where you want to go, but in the right way. So let's talk. Interesting. And what you were just saying there for me, Melody, especially when you were talking about those spikes, I kind of went to that whole diversity inclusion strategy in my mind, and where I was going was thinking, you know, we need to have differences in our organisation. So hey, if we're going for this flat line of everybody showing up at a particular level and us all being effective in everything, where does that really take our brainstorming, and where does that allow us to be different? Talk to me a bit more about what you see, or how you see assessment play an important part in these strategies for organisations.
Well, yeah, I think what you just said there around, you know, how you even use your competency model, or how you use your role profile, or whatever it is that you're, you know, assessing people against. Absolutely, you know, what organisations in this, you know, crazy world that we live in, where there is constant change and constant need to evolve and grow, we really do need diversity of experience, diversity of perspective, diversity of ways of doing things. And our natural tendency is to not have that. Our natural tendency is to want to work with people who are like us, because it's easier, and it flows more often because they work a similar way, they think a similar way, and that makes for perhaps a more harmonious, easier way of working. But what we lose from that is that creative challenge. What we lose is that different experiences, the different ways of thinking about things. So, you know, from a leadership effectiveness point of view, from an assessment point of view, acknowledging that having different, it's not about everybody being the same. It is about the spikes. It is about people bringing different competencies, different, you know, any job can be done in a number of different ways, and it drives me crazy when people say, well, we always hire the best person for the job, as though there is ever just one best person for the job. I've never seen that myself, because if that was true, you'd never be able to replace them. Because that one best person for the job's left it. You know, there's always just a range of different ways of doing things. And I remember once having a conversation with a colleague who was assessing 3 people for a CFO role, and we were talking, she'd come to me because I have a obsession with diagnostics and psychometrics. I really enjoy looking at them, and we were just talking about the diagnostics, and we were talking about the 3 different candidates for the role, and the truth was that any one of them could have done the job. And the conversation we had, and the conversation she went and subsequently had with the chief executive, was they can all do this job. How do you want it doing? What is it that you want this person to bring? You know, and there was one person who would maybe have been more of that sort of iron fist chief financial officer. There was one person who was much more around softer people skills. And, you know, the question I was asking her as well, what's the chief executive like? If they're kind of like a duo, do they want they really probably want someone who's different to them, who will bring something different. So to me, it's about often talk about selecting in, it's selecting for complementarity rather than selecting for similarity or sameness. So using the assessment data that you get to understand what will this person in a very holistic sense bring to this role, and maybe what's missing in our team or in our organisation. And I think historically people have gone about it the opposite way, which is let's bring in some more people who are like us. But you can use the same information to make a completely different decision, which is let's bring in some difference. And I think there's a couple of points I also think in our sort of day-to-day, moments of choice as managers, where that can really have an impact, particularly things like promotions, opportunities for talent programs. Those are times when we know that people from underrepresented groups often get overlooked. So having some kind of assessment process in there, particularly if you've got a self-nomination process as well, really makes a difference when it comes to getting more diverse candidates through on progressing in organisations and getting onto high potential schemes, etc. It makes a big difference.
It makes a huge difference, and I think what I'm hearing is that it may feel more comfortable to play safe, but actually, if we're talking about leadership effectiveness, it's the leader who appreciates that playing safe does not raise the bar and it does not lead to growth and achieving something innovative, achieving something new, forward focused. It plateaus. So it also, from how you're describing it, plays into some of those characteristics that we want to see for some of the roles that we assess when we're looking for effective leaders. How comfortable are they to ensuring that those around them are different to them?
Agreed. I often think that D&I is often around risk and people's perception of risk, and we often make the least risky decision without even realizing that that's what we're doing. But I think that if we are really want the value that having a diverse workforce brings, we have to acknowledge that might mean that we take what feel like more risky decisions, but also that we may acknowledge that there may be additional support that's required, or it may be that, I always think about that sort of forming, norming, storming, performing, team development model. You might spend more time in that forming and storming because of the differences that you're bringing together, and that it may take longer to work out how to work together. And that's really what being an inclusive leader is. It's about valuing that difference and wanting the difference to add value, and therefore needing to find ways of helping the team work together. But yes, absolutely, it can feel risky and uncomfortable.
But using that model that you just shared, that when you get past those hurdles, your performing phase is a really powerful spot.
Definitely.
Worth fighting for.
Yeah, but it has to be well managed. So a diverse team that's not well managed will perform worse than a homogenous team. A diverse team will perform better than a homogenous team if you manage and create that inclusive environment. That's such an important, there's no point in bringing in diversity if you're not going to really value it and create the environment where the different voices can be heard.
So when you think about the assessment process with a diversity inclusive hat on, and how organisations embrace this. For some, it will be a complete shift, and for others, it will be, we just need to continue to go here. We're doing reasonably well. We want to go to the next level. Are there tips that you would say, you know, these are 3 things? This is what the D&I strategy from an assessment perspective should flow like.
But there's 2 elements I think that are particularly important to look at from a recruitment assessment perspective. One is the behaviours, so and that's of the hiring managers, the talent acquisition, or whoever, HR, whoever are involved in recruitment. So thinking about what are inclusive assessment, inclusive recruitment behaviours, and training people in that. I've been doing a lot of that recently. It seems to be something that organisations are really focusing on. What are the behaviours that we really want people, reminding them, helping them understand where bias shows up? What are the processes that will help them manage their biases through the process? And incidentally, I think, for people like you and I who've been interviewing and assessing for years, it's just as important for us. People who've been interviewing for a long time often have quite bad habits when it comes to biases. And then the other aspect, I think, is around looking at the process itself. So more of a kind of structural design aspect of your recruitment process and your interview process as part of that, your assessment. How do you minimize the opportunities for bias? How do you attract as broad a range of candidates as possible? So it's a combination of focusing on the individuals who are doing it, but in the at the same time making sure your process supports and reinforces the behaviours that you're wanting them to use. So I would say it's a kind of a twofold approach.
And something that, as you say, you're spending quite a bit of time consulting in this space. So it isn't something that you can just flick a switch and say, okay, this is what we're doing now. Everybody follow suit. Given we're talking about behaviours, we need to spend time here and really understand what is going on within an organisation, and therefore context being everything in this space.
Exactly. And elements of context that are phenomenally important that we often forget about is the external context as well. What kind of sector are we in? How, I often work with organisations that maybe have an engineering or tech focus, and for them there will be some elements of diversity, for instance gender diversity, that may be quite difficult because they are historically, girls have not studied STEM subjects. Yeah. So there's lots of things that are going on from a contextual perspective that are both within an organisation and outside of an organisation that you really need to think about when you're thinking about this. And then I would say that, you said 3 things. I think the third thing is actually nothing to do with recruitment and assessment, and everything to do with making sure that when people land in the organisation, when you do bring in diverse individuals, that you are creating that inclusive culture. Otherwise they will just leave just as soon as they've joined, or they will leave, you'll get much higher turnover. So again, there's no point in focusing on the recruitment unless you're also focusing on that internal inclusive culture.
Which for me brings me back to the importance when it comes to organisations thinking about their leadership effectiveness, mapping that to where to their strategic objectives, and then thinking, as we said at the start, what are those behaviors, those competencies that we need to assess for in order to identify the leaders that can really drive this agenda, because there will be some characteristics in that would be quite unique from what we were just talking through.
Definitely. And there's quite a trend to look at inclusive leadership as a sort of separate thing, a separate model, and certainly I think there's some benefit of doing that, in that it places a focus, so you can kind of take a really deep dive into what really makes an inclusive leader. But I think that having inclusion throughout your competency model, so the elements of what makes an inclusive leader, in my view, it's just good leadership. So therefore, it should be in your leadership model already. And, you might see some organisations have just got it as a separate competency, but actually you can scatter it throughout your competency model so that it becomes an integral part of what being a good leader is. And then it's not that, well, I'll do inclusion, at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday. It's just part of being a really great leader and what kind of behaviours you want in your organisation.
I think on that, Melody, what we're signing off with is the fact that it's about being a good human.
Yeah.
And acknowledging all of that being important to everything that we do. And I've really enjoyed our conversation. We've gone in various directions, and maybe my last question for you, if I can, if somebody's listening to this and they're about to go into an assessment next week, their organisation have invited them to one, or they have put their hand up to say, I'd like to learn more about myself. Do you have a tip?
I would say 2 things. One is spend a little bit of time reflecting on some examples, because it just can be helpful to not go in there completely cold. But the other thing is be yourself, be honest. There's no point in trying to pretend to be someone you're not, because the benefit is an honest appraisal of you as you are, not someone who you are pretending to be.
And maybe I can add a third and just build on that one, Melody, because if you're going into an assessment wanting to project something that isn't a true reflection of who you are, a credible assessor will know that. And it paints a different picture on maybe the debrief. So being yourself is it also means that you and your assessor have a rich and robust conversation.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Newland Rock Leadership Effectiveness Podcast with me, your host, Kate Thomas. If you would like more information on how I can help you or your organisation maximise your talent and leadership effectiveness strategies, then reach out to me through my website, newlandrock.com.